Our next speaker is Constance Hilliard. Dr. Hilliard is professor of evolutionary history at the University of North Texas and has pioneered the field of African evolutionary history.
Good morning. Get this thing started. Slideshow. Okay, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Cindy. And I'm just delighted that I'm coming after John Mather because I feel that what I have to say is a segue in, from his really excellent presentation of the variables. Okay, what I'm going to talk about today is precision nutrition at the intersection of history and genomics. And before I get started, I would like to present a disclosure statement. I have no relevant financial or non-financial relationships to disclose. Okay, the fundamental issue that I have been grappling with is the point that both precision medicine and precision nutrition only work when they are precise. Now, it may seem as a well, this is what we're all talking about anyhow, but in reality, there's a particular gap within discussions oftentimes of precision medicine and nutrition. And I want to try to fill a portion of that gap by giving you a case study. So what can we learn about the etiology of the unusually high rate of hypertension and kidney failure in African Americans? And the underlying point of what I have to say is about genetic populations, population groups, in the sense that we talk about precision medicine, but oftentimes when we really get to the data is focused on a particular genetic population, which tends to be people of European ancestry. And I want for you to have a greater sense of the importance of genetic populations as well. For decades, medical researchers have searched for answers to the 75% rate of salt-sensitive hypertension in African Americans. And this is a very serious problem. In fact, it's really a crisis situation, because this leads to kidney failure. And during this moment of COVID, many of the comorbidities that have been killing African Americans related to these hypertensive diseases and so forth. Okay, so the primary point is that there is a problem in the medical community in terms of lacking a more precise knowledge of particular ecological niche populations. And I'll say more about this issue of ecological niches in a moment. Medical researchers, for instance, have traveled to African countries and tested inhabitants of coastal cities like Accra, Lagos, Banjul, in an effort to try to pin down the etiology of this really unusually high hypertension rate in African Americans. But they weren't able to see it. So let me identify some of the fallacies that we need to work through. First and foremost, race is not a scientific concept, and I'm sure all of us know this by now, but I'll say it anyhow. And it should not be considered in medicine, except when we're dealing with issues of discrimination and exclusion and equity and so forth. But in terms of actual medical research, DNA ancestry gives us a much sharper focus. And understanding ecological niche populations will give us even more precision as I explain what's going on here. Okay, contrary to common belief, the ancestors of Black Americans did not come from the coast of West Africa. They were merely loaded onto slave ships there after being kidnapped and marched in chains from the deep interior, and this was 500 miles from the interior to the coast, and in some cases it was even more, it was 1,000 miles. Okay. But the issue is, why does this matter? And here I'm getting to the nub of my discussion. The reason is because coastal West Africans, like Europeans, were genetically accustomed to consuming 5,000 milligrams of sodium a day. However, the ancestors of African Americans of slave descent lived on a dietary sodium intake of 200 milligrams a day, which is a level so low that many medical professionals did not think people could even survive on 200, but these were people who were farming in the tropics. They had become genetically adapted to inhabiting one of the most sodium deficient regions of the world. And see, when I talk about the need for precision in dealing with genetic populations, this is the point I'm making, because if we don't know where African Americans of slave descent came from, then there are certain health conditions for which we will have no clue as to the etiology and therefore the best approach. Oh, and also, because of the tropical climate, it was not possible to create trade networks for salt that went from the coast into the interior, because the products, the salt products, would become rancid. Okay, over the course of the last several decades, it is not as though no one talked about or thought about, gee, what is going on in terms of African American hypertension? And so what emerged was what was known as the slave hypothesis. And this theory essentially said that 6 slaves were thrown overboard, and the survivors were theorized to function on lower sodium levels. Now, actually, the theory makes absolute total sense, and 6 slaves were indeed thrown overboard. But it just so happens that that is not the cause for salt-sensitive hypertension. And the reason it's so critical for us to get to the cause is that that gives us the strongest clues as to what to do about it. Now, let me just pause for a second and say, I'm an African evolutionary historian. And so I'm not a nutritionist or a medical researcher. I'm not dealing with those kinds of statistics or clinical trials. But I do have methodological tools that come in handy. Over the years, I've translated manuscripts from Timbuktu and ancient Songhai and some of these areas in the interior of West Africa for which we as Westerners have had extremely little knowledge. And this is the kind of precision that I hope to bring to this larger discussion. So precious was salt in these societies that the elites traded their gold for it. And this was literally pound for pound. But what we really want to understand is that the subsistence farmers, the peasant farmers at the lowest levels of the society, they had no access to salt. And the kind of salt that was being traded for gold was rock salt from the Sahara Desert. But it was only the elites who could even have little pieces of rock salt. The peasant farmers had none. Their diet was nevertheless high in potassium, which came from them burning millet leaves and flavoring their food with the ashes and so forth. And also the point is, it's not as though these peasant farmers had no sodium, but the sodium simply came. It was the natural sodium from the vegetables they ate and from the meats they ate and so forth. And then we have the history. In the 17th century, an enormously profitable market for skilled farmers developed in the New World. And of course, we all know about Columbus and Europeans settling in North and South America and so forth. It was the peasant farmers, not the elites, from these decentralized societies who became vulnerable to being kidnapped by slave traders. And this is really a critical point. We know that African Americans came from Africa, but not only did they come from Africa and West Africa, they came from a very well delineated ecological niche. And it just so happened that it was an environment that made them especially vulnerable to being kidnapped and enslaved by both Europeans and the populations on the coast. So let me clarify for a minute what I'm talking about in terms of ecological niche populations. African Americans of slave descent are, of course, not a race, but come from an ecological niche that is sufficiently unique that their ancestors had to evolve certain genotypes that made it possible to survive in this extremely low sodium environment, which is even more difficult because it's extremely hot. Okay, so what we know now through further developments in genomics and genetics is that there are certain gene variants, the APOL1 gene variants, that have a major role in sodium metabolism, but different genetic populations have different gene variants. And this is why I'm focusing on the need to inject the issue of genetic populations into the discussion of personalized medicine. The G1 and G2 APOL1 gene variants are found almost exclusively in people of the West African interior, okay? Medical researchers have recently even found that if a person has either one of these variants, they are from 2 to 100 times more likely to end up with kidney disease. And on the way to kidney disease, certainly hypertension. Okay. So what health clues do we find at this intersection of African American history and genomics? African Americans of slave descent consume 1,700% more sodium than their ancestors who were adapted to the low sodium interior. And when I talk about adaptations, I'm not talking about it doesn't happen in 5 years or 10 years. This is over the course of thousands of years where it really is a Darwinian process of the survivors because those are the genes that rise, the gene variants that rise to the top. However, Americans of European ancestry, and it's not just Americans of European ancestry, because even Americans, recent West African immigrants to America usually come from coastal cities. And so it's a very similar profile when it comes to sodium metabolism, 5,000 milligrams a day. And this is 32% less sodium than their ancestors. And this is interestingly variable as well, because if you look at Scandinavians, their average sodium intake before the advent of refrigeration was 10,000 milligrams of sodium. And so we have to be careful when we're universalizing research of all these particular genetic populations with different characteristics. So who benefits most and who benefits least from an American average sodium intake of 3,400 milligrams a day? 5,000 milligrams and 200 milligrams really cannot be averaged if our goal is to improve the health of, in particular, these two diverse genetic populations. Rather, they will need to be stratified, not by race, but by DNA ancestry and ecological niche, as I had described previously. over the last few years, I put together this ancestral gene variance model in order to help us deal with the added complexity that precision medicine really demands of us, particularly because when we're talking about genetic populations, we're not only talking about people who might be different from Europeans and Asians and this and that and whatever, we're also talking about the fact that African Americans and many minorities in the United States are admixed populations, meaning that there's an interesting formula, in a sense, a profile. A person of African American of slave descent will generally be, on average, 75% West African, whereas a Nigerian American will be 100% or 99% Niger Kordofanian. And so African American, 75 Niger Kordofanian, 25% Northern European. And I was fortunate to get the help of a mathematician colleague of mine, Dr. Wang, who put this together for me into a formula so that it could be more obvious to the medically minded that we're not just talking about sodium, we're talking about sodium and calcium and those particular elements for which there are population differences. And one other example is something even as important as delineating scores for kidney transplants, because African Americans are admixed. So what is the big picture here? 21st century nutritional and health research operates from what is essentially an outdated paradigm. We've moved into a new era, but we have not developed the necessary tools in certain circumstances to really take greatest advantage of it. So what is this antiquated paradigm? And I'm so glad that John Mathers was talking about a particular dimension of the same issue, a one-size-fits-all paradigm. It is this pre-human genome project, pre-precision medicine, pre-precision nutrition model that says there's one number for everybody. And even though the number is average, if in fact you're dealing with populations with extreme differences caused by genetic adaptations, then you're going to have a problem. And especially if you're not even aware that you're functioning from a paradigm that tends to over universalize the genetic traits of people of European heritage. So the USDA recommends that adults consume less than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day. We happen to know that most Americans, regardless of their ethnic background or whatever, consume about 3,400 milligrams of sodium per day. But here's the point. Neither of these figures serve the health interests of 37 million Americans of West African descent and who were of slave origin. It's not just individuals that we're talking about. We're talking about genetic populations, okay? And so let me say in closing that if we wish to improve our overall health, and in particular, my focus on African American health, we are absolutely going to have to inject this other dimension into our discussions. And the other dimension really relates to something that has really become counterintuitive in terms of the discoveries that are being made in the century. Counterintuitive because it turns out that certain disease triggers vary from one genetic population to the next, so that even if you can be precise with one population, it turns out you'll be totally off base with another. And the essential problem here is that about 88% of our genetic databases are European, 3% are African, but Africans have many more genetic variants than Europeans. So you can see how some of the issues that might seem quite precise turn out to be extremely imprecise when you're looking at a different genetic population. So what I'm essentially saying here is that I'm not good at PR, so other people can do a much better job, but we have to come up with a plan to deal with this issue, because it's otherwise we're going to leave out portions of our population. So with Plan A, I was mentioning, I'm not sure, this is probably not a very good idea. It's probably very difficult. You have nutritional labels and you put different ancestry, except that in this case, in the case of sodium, you're only talking about two primary differences: people from low sodium areas and everybody else. Okay, but then the other point I was thinking of is Plan B, which is probably more doable. Because what I came to realize is that there's only one message that goes out, a nutritional message, and it's presumably to everybody. But then if you really break it down, it really is not effective for certain groups, apart from dealing with individuals. And so education and messaging are vitally, vitally important. Most African Americans do not know that present sodium levels are killing them. Now, of course, we've all heard about sodium and reducing our sodium levels and so forth and so on. But at the same time, if you read medical journals, especially some articles coming out of research coming out of Scandinavia, they're saying, oh, we put too much emphasis on salt, and salt is so important that we shouldn't be doing this. But the reality is that we have a complex society and we need to open our minds to the needs of everyone. So
we're going to need you to start finishing up, Dr. Hilliard.
Oh, okay. What is important in terms of African Americans is that it's not, and it shouldn't be conveyed in terms of, oh, you people have a pathology. Because actually, African Americans like myself inherited a gift from our West African ancestors of efficient kidneys. And these kidneys have to be protected in an environment where the history is one of enormous sodium intakes. And so the last point I would like to make is that modern genomics and testing of DNA ancestry has given American society the opportunity to bring greater precision to not just the sodium needs, but the nutritional needs of all Americans. And as a consequence, we must begin to see ourselves as not just multi-ethnic and multiracial, but as multi-genomic as well. Thank you very much. I should also like to thank in particular Dr. Patrick Stover, Vice Chancellor and Dean for Agriculture and Life Sciences at Texas A&M, for giving me the opportunity to be on this platform, and also Professor Wang at the University of North Texas for helping me translate the mathematical format. So thank you all very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hilliard, for that excellent case study of an ecological niche that can influence genotypes, nutritional requirements, and disease risk.